Hello, friends. There we go. All right, I think we're ready to go. I think we're set. I think we've got all the technology in place that needs to be in place. And I see people in the chat already. Hi there, Conrad. And okay, Subdued Moon, I know you because I know your icon. But what is your name? I can't remember. It's going to come to me. Sammy. Okay, there we go. Hi, Sammy, and Julia, and Sydney, and Madison. Good to see you all. Yay. I'm glad to see you here. We are talking about all kinds of stuff tonight. We're talking about ancestors. We're talking about faith passed down from people before us. Ooh, yay, more people. And there's Ellis and Emmy and Jade. There we go. And Melissa. Sam, I got there eventually. It just took me a minute. Yay, glad to see you all. If you're here and you want to say hi in the chat, go for it. It's always nice to see who's here. Nice to see what's going on with people. And we'll get into our Bible study here in a minute. I hope you all are doing well. I always want to do like a little hey, how's it going before we get started? And then I'm like, oh, wait, there's lag. So I have to say, hey, how's it going? And then wait for you all to respond. So how's it going, everybody in the chat? Oop, Emmy says, does everybody else hear a scratchy sound or just me? Well, I'm getting a... Oh. Okay, I'm getting a notification that there's something up with the bit rate of the sound. Let me see if I can fix it. Let's see. Hi, Amory, and hi, Jenny. Good to see you. Let's see. I wonder if the scratchy sound you're hearing is my fan. It might be. I'm going to turn it off, and we'll find out if that was the scratchy sound. Okay, is there less scratchy sound now? Let me know how this sounds. Yay, and there's Conrad, and there's Bryn. Let me know if there's less scratchy sound now, or if it's a bitrate problem that I might have to fix in a more complicated manner. If it was just turning off my fan, then that would be the easy fix. Aw, I'm sorry, Ellis. Oh, that was it. Okay. Yeah, rip your room temp. Yes, rip my room temp indeed. I'm going to be sweaty by the end of this Bible study. I hope you'll excuse my sweatiness. But good. I'm glad it sounds better. Now I just know that my fan does that. Oh, Conrad says it's a feedback sound. Well, I'm hoping this sounds better because it sounds like for most people it's better. So fingers crossed. Okay, I'm getting... mixed update on the sound situation. So if it keeps being obnoxious, we might have to revisit, but for now we might let it go. Okay, cool. All right, seems good. So we're going to let it go for now. If it becomes obnoxious later on, we'll figure something out. But I hope this is okay. It's good to see you all. It's good to be here for Bible study. Good to see, who was it that said that they hadn't normally been to Bible study, but then they saw the thing? Was that, I think it was Sydney. Yes, cool. Glad to have you here, Sydney. So, like I said, today we're talking about ancestors, and we're talking about faith being passed down. So, I think to give you a little background about where this particular theme is coming from, it actually came from Madison, who I think is here. Yeah, I saw Madison in there. Madison and I last week were talking about ancestry, and it brought up all these thoughts about ancestors and people that came before and connecting to them. And so Madison is actually the one responsible for our theme today. And so I was glad to have that conversation and have that brought up. So what I was thinking about and what Madison and I had been talking about was the fact that for some of us LGBTQ+ folks, we may not have the best relationship with our immediate families. They may just be difficult relationships, or they may be non-existent relationships. Or they may be generally good relationships, but like it's still a little touchy sometimes. So if you're somebody that has a sort of difficult relationship with your immediate family, it can be nice to think about connections to your family members from long ago. Like it can be nice to think about like your great-grandparents, right? Like you might, or I mean, for myself, I actually lived with my great-grandpa for a little while when we were kids, so I knew my great-grandpa, but like my great-great-grandpa, I didn't know. And it's nice to think sometimes about those connections that we have beyond just our sort of nuclear family, that we come from a like whole lines of people, right? Like we have all of this, we have all of the, in some ways we hold the collective spirits of the people that went before us. And so it was just a nice thing that we were talking about, and it made me think about our spiritual ancestors. Like we have our physical ancestors, right? The people that, you know, sort of gave birth to us in a variety of ways, but we also have our spiritual ancestors that sort of the people that passed faith to us. And that can be, there can be a whole bunch of different kinds of ways that people do that. But it got me thinking about how that theme of remembering the faith of people who went before you and taking strength from that shows up a lot in the Psalms. So we're going to be looking at two Psalms tonight that both talk about the faith of historical figures and taking strength from their faith. This is actually something that I once made a video about on my personal channel as part of the Transgender and Christian series. I talked about taking strength from the faith of people before us. So if this sounds a little familiar, it's because I've talked about it once before, but really diving into it with you all now I think is going to be fun. So we're going to look at two Psalms, and I'll put the text up here. Oh, let me fix this so that you can see a little better. There we go. So tonight's texts are Psalm 77 and Psalm 105. Those are the two that we're going to be looking at. And we are going to, I think we're going to start out with Psalm 105. We're actually going to do the later psalm first. So if you've got a Bible near you and you can flip it open to Psalm 105, it's always great to know what text people are reading from, what translations you're reading from. And if you don't have one near you, we have the internet for that. So I will put in the chat here, there we go, a link to a translation on the one I'm going to be reading, which is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. And that's the text that I usually read from, so that's the one I'm going to be using. And then if you are reading from a different translation, I'm always interested to know if there are major differences that you see in your translation versus the one that I read. So we're going to start out with Psalm 105 and go from there. Oh good, I'm glad Julia's on board with this idea of studying our spiritual ancestors. So we're going to start with Psalm 105. Now, this one is a bit of a long psalm. It's part of, when you look at the Psalms, so there's 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms, and you can split them up in a variety of ways. Usually people split them up by structure or by theme, and so Psalm 105 is one of the Psalms that is usually talked about as a historical psalm. It's all about like teaching the history of Israel and remembering the history of Israel. So that's what Psalm 105 is all about, is like telling the whole story of the people of Israel pretty much in a short form. So we're going to read through Psalm 105, and we're going to stop a couple of times because this is a long psalm. We're going to stop a couple of times and talk about what we see. So we're going to start, and we're going to go verses 1 through we're going to go verses 1 through 15 to start out with. So that's going to be the first bit we're going to read. So keep an eye out for differences in translation that you might see for these first 15 verses. So Psalm 105 goes like this. O give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all his wonderful works. Glory in his holy name, let the hearts of those who sing to the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord in his strength, seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works he has done, his miracles and the judgments he has uttered, O offspring of his servant Abraham, children of Jacob, his chosen one. So that's like our prologue, right? That's the prologue to this particular psalm, is like setting us up that this is going to be giving thanks for good things that God has done in history. So now, starting in verse 7, He is the Lord our God, His judgments are in all the earth. He is mindful of His covenant forever, of the word that He commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that He made with Abraham, His sworn promise to Isaac, which He confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. When they were few in number, of little account, and strangers in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another, He allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. So that's the first 15 verses of this psalm, and it's setting us up for the story, right? So I wonder, first of all, if there are things that you notice, any differences in translation that you notice in those first 15 verses between the NRSV and maybe what you're reading. What we've got in these first 15 verses are kind of three sections. We've got sort of the prologue, sing to God, glory in His name, and then we've got the beginning of the covenant with Abraham. That's where the story starts. So you notice the story doesn't start here with like Adam and Eve, right? It doesn't go all the way to the beginning. It starts with God's covenant with Abraham, which was like the official beginning of the Israelite people. So it was very important to them. So we've got the covenant made with Abraham, sworn promise to Isaac. He confirmed to Jacob as a statute, right? And to Israel as an everlasting covenant. So you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The three major patriarchs are right there. And then it continues on to say there were few in number, there weren't very many people, but God allowed no one to oppress them and rebuked kings on their account, saying, do not touch my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. So that's the first section here. Sorry, Conrad, I tripped you up by starting us with 105. Maybe I'll change it in the text here since we're going to do 105 first. I started doing it earliest one first, but if we're doing it this way, I'll fix it for you, so then people won't be as confused. So, looking at these first sections, we get the first part of the story of Israel, and I wonder what you all think about the first question I'm kind of putting to everybody tonight is, what is the difference between the historical memory of an event, the way that it's sort of like the way that it's remembered versus the way that it actually happened? Because there are usually differences, right? We tend to see things differently in hindsight than the way that it actually happened. We might be a little bit more, there might be more of a rosy glow to things that happened in the past. We might remember the good stuff more than the bad stuff. And so I'm wondering if that might be happening a little bit in this psalm. And specifically, I'm looking at verse 14 and 15. It says, He allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. And I wonder if it's, sorry, I got distracted by Conrad's comment about it being really old. Yeah, I'm betting that, I'm not familiar with that translation, Conrad, but it sounds like it would be pretty different. I will have to look up that, more about that particular variation, more about that particular translation. It sounds interesting. But so this question of like, in this psalm, we are told that God protected Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, and the growing tribe of Israel, and He allowed no one to oppress them and rebuked kings on their account. And I'm wondering if you all think that that's accurate based on like the stories that you remember of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Did God really protect them from being oppressed? And so, like, does that ring true with the stories that you know? I'm interested if that's something that seems right to you, because it makes me kind of go, really? Because when I read the stories in Genesis, I don't have the sense that, like, God kept specific kinds of oppression and bad things from happening to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some bad stuff happened to them. And so I'm wondering if the psalmist is maybe a little rosy in his understanding of the past. So I'm wondering what you all think about that. Amory, you're pointing to the Canaanite genocide, but I'm not sure in regards to what. Is it just that you're saying that it doesn't specifically speak to that? There's that verse in verse 11, where it says, God says, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance, which very much doesn't tell the history of the people that already lived in that land, the Canaanites, right? So I'm assuming that's what you mean, is that like the text is just saying like God showed up and said, this land is for you, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and doesn't really touch the fact that people were already living there at the time. So yeah, in that way, it's not exactly accurate as a history, because it's telling, it's the whole thing about like history being written by the victors, right? It's not telling the story of what happened to the people that already lived there. So that's true. Ella says, there are specific instances where God protects Abraham from oppression of specific kings, I think. True, Ellis. That was actually one of the things I was thinking of. I assumed that was what it was referring to, where it says he rebuked kings on their account. There are 2 times in the story of Abraham specifically where Abraham goes to a king and pretends that, like, tries to pass his wife Sarah off as his sister because he's worried that if the king finds out that they're married, the king will kill him to take Sarah. And so Abraham 2 times does this screw up. And then later, if I'm remembering correctly, I believe Isaac does it as well. Or maybe it's Jacob. One of his kids or grandkids does the same thing. The sense of like, we're going to pretend that my wife is really my sister so that I don't get in trouble. And then God kind of gets in the middle of it and usually sends the king a dream and says, hey, just so you know they're married, they're under my protection, don't touch them. So that bit about rebuking kings is very true to the stories that we're told. Oh, Conrad, that would be very confusing if the numbering of the verses is different. That's an interesting thing about translations. Different translations sometimes will have different verse numbers. And yeah, you might want to try a different Bible, Conrad, unless you can pick out which verse is which. If anybody ever reads out of a Hebrew Bible, out of like the Tanakh or the collection of the writings in Hebrew traditions, the verse numbers are different there as well. So it's the thing is, there are no original verses, there are no verse numbers, I should say, in the original text. So people kind of put them where they want to put them sometimes. Yeah, so Melissa says, but did God allow no one to oppress them? Yeah, so that's kind of my question, is like, is that true? And I think that there are times when, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob get into scrapes. Like, for instance, you could argue that Jacob, who ends up working for his father-in-law Laban in almost like a forced indentured servant kind of deal for a long time, was under a kind of oppression. So it just feels a little bit rosy to say, well, nobody ever oppressed them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their whole family. Nobody ever oppressed them, and it seems a little rosy maybe. Yeah, Conrad, translation of the Septuagint. That was something that I was actually talking with Julia about last week. So you two are both reading a Septuagint translation, it seems like. Madison says, it's a very positive outlook. I'm not sure it's necessarily meant to be a historical perspective, so I'm not sure it's fair for me to critique it as such. Rather, it's only meant to be a praise for the positives that happened in this time. That's very true, Madison. The point of this text is praising God for all the good things God has done. It's not necessarily meant to be historically accurate. But I think the reason that I bring it up is not for us to like get and pick apart and take apart this psalm and be like, oh, it's trash. It's just to recognize that sometimes our historical understandings of things don't fully reflect all that happened. And the reason that I bring that up is because when we're thinking about our spiritual ancestors, like for instance, thinking about some of the saints, right? Some of the official saints of the church, there are like a lot of saints who did really, really wonderful things, but then they also did some pretty bad things a lot of times, and we don't hear about those all the time. So the reason that I bring this up is just to sort of remind us that like the historical perspective we have a lot of the time we might not be getting the whole story. And I think that's important to remember, not because it means that we shouldn't appreciate those saints, for instance, but I think that it keeps us from thinking that anybody is perfect. And that's, I guess, what I worry about when I think about like people of faith of the past, is I worry about deifying them and making them perfect in my mind, because then the relationship that they have with God is something I can never get to because they were perfect and I'm not, right? Or we think about them and we think, well, they were perfect and they never did anything wrong, and then when it turns out maybe that they do something wrong, we're super disappointed, right? So I just think I think this was a good moment to think about the ways that we want to keep from pretending that anybody is anything more than human. So even when we're talking about our ancestors, they were human too, and that's okay. Anyway, that's my soapbox. Yes, just agreeing with everybody in the chat here. Melissa says, the actual stories are often more detailed, documenting the good and the bad, than the songs about those stories. There's a purpose for the song that demands telling only a part of the story. That's a really good explanation, Melissa. Thank you. Ella says, humans like to tell stories multiple times and emphasize different things in different tellings. That's why we have two versions of creation right next to each other. Very true. Ooh, Mandy, I like that. Mandy says, there's an old saying that every saint was once a sinner. No one is perfect. Yeah. Yeah, Amory says, I recently shocked my practical theology class by mentioning that Dietrich Bonhoeffer might have been gay. Yeah, there are all these things that it's like, if we're reading them as historical documents of any kind, there are going to be parts that we don't know about maybe and might be surprised to hear and might not necessarily please us. Dietrich Bonhoeffer being gay would please me, but maybe not other people. Emmy says, reminds me of how a lot of Christians glorify the early church almost to the point of idolization, speaking as a seminary student, but they were messed up just like us. Yes, so that's exactly the point that I'm trying to get to, is like, if we think about the people that came before us and our ancestors in faith as perfect, non-fallible people, it just puts them at this greater distance from us and doesn't allow us to realize that we can also do good in the world. So that's kind of what I was going for there. Oh, good, Conrad, I'm glad you got that figured out. I'm confused by your comment there, Julia. Say a little bit more about that, and I'll see if I can figure out. This is the problem with chat, is that you can only type so much, and then it's hard to like fully get people's understandings of what's going on and ideas. So let's read the next part of this particular psalm here. So we've gotten all the way up to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their family is multiplying in the land, right? So we're starting at verse 16, and we are going to read, what are we going to read to? Let's just read 16 through 25, and then we'll take another short break. So starting in verse 16, it says, when he summoned famine against the land and broke every staff of bread, he sent a man ahead of him, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, his neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord kept testing him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to instruct his officials at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. Then Israel came to Egypt. Jacob lived as an alien in the land of Ham, and the Lord made his people very fruitful and made them stronger than their foes, whose hearts he then turned to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. So this is the next part of the story. We got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now we get the story of Joseph happening in verses 16 to 26. Is Joseph in Egypt. So we've got a lot going on here, right? We've got God summoning a famine against the land, which is part of the story in Genesis. That bit there, if you're wondering when it says he broke every staff of bread, weird cultural thing that a lot of times, scholars think that a lot of times the flat bread that was baked in that part of the world, one of the ways you would store it is by taking a stick and like if you think of like pita bread, right? Taking a stick and like essentially puncturing a hole in the center of the bread and then just putting it, like stacking it up on a stick. And that would be a staff of bread. So if you're wondering what a staff of bread is, that would be what it is, we think. So we have this story where God sends this famine on the land, and Joseph is sold as a slave in Egypt. And we've got this bit of Joseph being in Egypt. The king releases Joseph and makes him lord of all the house. And then all of Israel, right, all the rest of the descendants of Israel come to Egypt to live in Egypt with Joseph, rather. And the Lord makes them very fruitful. And then we've got this weird thing in verse 25 where it says, whose hearts he then turned to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. And that's always, like, if you're one of those people that's upset by, in the Exodus story, is upset by the idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, this is kind of the same problem here, where it's like, why would God make people hate other people? So it's a little bit weird with that verse, and I'm interested to know how you all maybe understand that. I don't have a good answer for it, other than I think it might be easier for the person writing this psalm to attribute things to God than to people. And so maybe that's what's going on. But there's this interesting thing there in verse 25, and I'd be interested to know what you all think about it. Conrad says, I think it's neat to think about my grandma and the saints praying for me too. Yes, absolutely. Conrad, that's something that I want us to talk about a little bit towards the end of our hour together here, is that our relationship with the saints and those who went before us. So we'll get there, I promise. Ellis says, rotisserie pita. Yeah, bread staff, rotisserie pita. Oh, I see. So Julia is elaborating on what she said earlier. As I dig into the Bible, I study the Bible study with our ancestors, understood the Bible, and it's confusing because it changes over time for good and bad reasons. Yeah, that's very true, Julia. People have translated and interpreted the Bible differently for hundreds and thousands of years, and sometimes, I mean, everybody has a lens, right? That's kind of the... If we take nothing away from our Bible studies together, I hope we can take away the knowledge that everybody comes to this with their own particular lens that they're seeing things through, and that includes people who translate things, and that includes people who write theology. There is no way to read the Bible that is 100% free of bias or wanting to do things for a particular reason. So yeah. Sometimes good reasons, sometimes bad reasons. Madison says, how many servings per staff? I don't know. So Ella says, I find to deal craftily with his servants striking here, because so often it's the heroes of Bible stories who are crafty, often to undercut oppression. Yeah, it's a weird thing, that word that's used there, to deal craftily with his servants. It's funny because I think in the modern world, or like in English now, we think of the word crafty and it usually means like suspicious, or like there's some negative connotation to it. And sometimes that's true in scripture too, but a lot of times crafty just means like, I don't know, it doesn't seem to have the same totally negative connotation, which is interesting. So yeah, I also find that a really interesting sentence, and kind of, it feels a little bit almost out of place somehow. I don't know why. Sam says, narratively, it's a good contrast from 14 and 15, since that one said that he wouldn't allow harm to come to them. Yeah, right, you've got like the thing that says no harm will come to them, and then right after that you have the story of Joseph being put in slavery and definitely oppressed, right? So it's interesting. Then you've got this end of like God kind of putting the people have gone into a place where they are oppressed, but God is still giving them the upper hand in a way, which is interesting. Sydney says, okay, so Conrad, first of all, Conrad, I don't want to miss Conrad's comment. I think, Conrad, this is in reference to the bit about God hardening hearts. And Conrad says, it helps you to know God is in control even when everyone hates you. And yeah, that might be a little bit of the hardened hearts thing, is that like, if you think that God made people hate you, maybe then you at least feel like God is in control of what's going on. If people are just hating you and it feels like God isn't protecting you from that hate, maybe it feels less like God is in control. So yeah, I can see that as an argument or like a way of understanding it. Personally, I think I would have a harder time thinking of God as somebody, as a being who would want to make people hate. That would make me less trusting of God, I think. But maybe that's not always the case. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. Sydney says, it's very difficult to process the whole hardening of heart shtick. I have heard it taught by some as being more given over to their innate desires rather than deliberate hardening. But it's a very difficult passage. Yeah, that's usually when we talk about Pharaoh and Pharaoh's heart being hardened. We notice that there are like multiple times where Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And then I think there's only one time where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So it's this sense of like, eventually if you are hardening your heart against something for long enough, that's just sort of it in terms of like your ability to change. Like if you harden yourself against something for long enough, change begins to feel nearly impossible. And maybe that's what that idea is referencing, is that like, I don't know. That's really interesting though. Julia says, when God hardened the king's heart, it just means he forced him to make a choice. Yeah, I can see that. That like, if you, that sense of like you can no longer take anything in. You're hardened off and closed off to taking new things in. And so then you just have to make a choice with what's there. And I could see that. That's a really interesting interpretation, Julia. Yeah, same with what Robin's saying. I'd heard a hardening of the heart meant being closed-minded. The idea is that the heart was the seat of the mind. Yeah, that's definitely another good way to put it. Like if you have just said, you know what, I'm not even going to consider that position. That's definitely a way of hardening your heart. So anyways, then we've got the end of Joseph's story there. So then we're going to move on to Moses' story, starting in verse 26. And now we're going to go all the way through the end of this particular psalm. So starting in verse 26 and going to the end. So when we last left off, we had Joseph and Joseph's family enslaved in Egypt. God sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them, the miracles in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and made the land dark. They rebelled against his words. He turned their waters into blood and caused their fish to die. Their land swarmed with frogs, even in the chambers of their kings. He spoke, and there came swarms of flies and gnats through their country. He gave them hail for rain and lightning that flashed through their land. He struck their vines and fig trees and shattered the trees of their country. He spoke and the locusts came, the young locusts without number. They devoured all the vegetation in their land and ate up the fruit of the ground. He struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first issue of all their strength. Then he brought Israel out with silver and gold, and there was no one among their tribes who stumbled. Egypt was glad when they departed, for dread of them had fallen upon it. He spread a cloud for covering and fire to give light by night. They asked, and he brought quails and gave them food from heaven in abundance. He opened the rock, and water gushed out. It flowed through the desert like a river. For he remembered his holy promise, and Abraham his servant. So he brought his people out with joy, his chosen ones with singing. He gave them the lands of the nations, and they took possession of the wealth of the peoples, that they might observe his statutes and keep his statutes and observe his laws. Praise the Lord. So that's the end of that very long psalm. Oh, I just noticed what Amory's comment was here. Yeah, so in the Aramaic and plain English version, which is interesting because I wonder how they got to Aramaic, Amory, because as far as I know, this psalm was written in Hebrew. So was it Aramaic or Hebrew translated into Aramaic, translated into English? I'm interested in that translation. I'll have to look it up. But yes, you're saying that in that particular translation, there's no sense of God changing people's hearts. It's they turned their hearts. Interesting. So this last bit of this particular psalm is we get the Exodus story, right? We get all the plagues. And it's interesting to note the plagues here that we read about in verses 26 through 36, the plagues aren't in the correct order as we understood them in Genesis and Exodus. Not Genesis, just in Exodus. the plagues aren't in that order. And so it's interesting that they're a little bit out of order here. But we get all the plagues, and then we get Israel leaving Egypt with silver and gold, and the Egyptians are glad that they're leaving. And then we have this idea of God leading them in a cloud by day and fire by night. And then we get quail and manna from heaven and water from the rock. And then all this in verse 42, it says, "For he remembered his holy promise and Abraham his servant." And then we get the last bit, verses 43 through 45, are sort of the epilogue of the psalm, is that says, like, they were given their land, they are given the land of milk and honey, and so that they can observe God's law and the new way that God wanted them to live. So, so Conrad's last version here, or last translation of the last verse, is that they might observe his justifications and seek after his law. Yeah, that's pretty accurate, I would say, as a translation. So, two things there that we can look at to see that are given as like reasons for why God did all this, right? We're given two reasons for this. The first reason we're given is in verse 42, "For he remembered his promise to Abraham." And then the second reason we're given is 44 and 45, where it says they were given all this land so that they can keep the statutes and observe God's laws. So we're given two reasons why God does these things for the people of Israel. And I think it makes sense, right, that this whole psalm is supposed to be about like why this all happened. Like, here are all the things that God did for us. And then the end is sort of like the moral at the end of the story, is like, so that we could be a better people and we could follow God's laws. But the verse that I wanted to kind of direct us to is that verse 42, "Because he remembered his promise to Abraham." So that to me connects to our conversation about ancestors, right? That apparently, according to Psalm 105, and this is true in other parts of the Bible as well, the Israelites understood that God did good things for them, and God's relationship with them was good because of God's promise to Abraham, right? God's promise to Abraham was supposed to last hundreds, like 100 generations, right? And thousands of generations. So like, it's all because of God's relationship with Abraham that a lot of this stuff happened. And so that got me thinking about, like, how do we understand our relationship as Christians to Abraham or to the people of Israel, right? Because for Christians, we kind of consider all of these folks, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, we consider them sort of some of our spiritual ancestors in a way as Christians, and Paul talks a lot about that in his letters. But they're usually, we wouldn't consider them to be like our physical ancestors, right? But it's still like we have a connection to them in a way. So I wonder what you all think about what your connection is as a Christian to these stories. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joseph. What do you see, like, do you see them as your ancestors, your spiritual ancestors in some way? Or how do you see your connection to them? So that's the question that I want to throw out to you all and see what you think. And then after that, we're going to go on to our Psalm 77, which is a much shorter psalm. I think for me, I'm like super comforted by the idea that God's relationship with Abraham and Abraham's passing on of his faith to his children helped his children out when they were less full of faith and faithful, both of those things. Because there were lots of times when Isaac and Jacob screwed up, and yet, because of God's love for Abraham, God's love went to them as well. And so that, to me, is kind of comforting, that like, sometimes I screw up, and yet God's faithfulness to our ancestors also comes to me because of God's relationship with them, if that makes sense. Like, God wants to know me because God knew them. And so there's a connection there for me that I find really comforting. Julia says, I mean, they could be. They could be connected. They could be spiritual ancestors. What do you mean, Julia? I'm interested in what you're saying there. I think the thing that's complex for us as Christians is that we don't want to overly identify, I think, as ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when our Jewish siblings definitely have that over on us, definitely have like more of the connection to these stories maybe than we do, or a different connection maybe is a better way of putting it. However, that was one of the things that the early church struggled with, right? Paul writes a lot about the idea of having, like, whether or not having a physical connection to these particular ancestors makes you better or worse. And Paul argues that it doesn't matter because of God's work in the world. And Jesus said also at one point, somebody was talking about how, like, whether it was important, how important it was to be sort of a physical ancestor or a physical descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jesus says something about, like, God could raise up sons for Abraham from these rocks, and, like, God can do whatever God wants. And I think that's kind of one of the things that is encouraging to me, is that God keeps trying to adopt people. That God starts off with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then just continually adopts more and more and more and more people, and especially folks that are on the outside. God just keeps adopting people. And I find that really encouraging, that, like, we could maybe see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph and Moses, and all the other folks in our biblical stories as adoptive parents in a way. And I think that's kind of cool. Addison says, I think it's pretty comforting that we have people that can come before us and can teach us how to walk with God. Yeah, agreed. There's so much that we can learn from folks in the Bible and all the people that have happened through human history since then. Sometimes we learn what not to do by watching them, and sometimes we learn what to do. Conrad says, I was learning about infant baptism lately as being similar to circumcision. This makes me think of the fact I was baptized as a baby, grafted onto the family of God and promise of the covenant in a way. That happened because my ancestry had been faithful Christians. I was born into it, kind of, which is neat. Yeah, there's a lot about being, that idea of, like, grafted on or adopted. That's a really prominent metaphor in Christianity, of being adopted into a family. And I think it's really cool to think about, like, knowing that that God wants to be part of our lives and picks us and says, hey, I want to be part of your life. And that sometimes, like you said, Conrad, people make that choice for us, and we have to decide whether it's a path that we still want to walk or not. Whether, like, if you're baptized as a baby, for instance, you then get to decide as an adult whether that's something that you want to live out. But the fact that it's, like, something that's given to you and it's kind of a gift from God and from your parents or whoever is taking care of you, it's kind of cool. Sam says, I think it's harder to connect with them as ancestors emotionally, but we're told we are. I don't know how it is in other denominations, but I think there's a strong need from Christians to keep the Bible, and not to make it too personable or relatable. I'm former CRC, if that gives context. Yeah. A strong need for Christians to keep the Bible. Yeah, it's like we want to keep it sort of preserved in amber and not touch it too much, or let us, or, you know, it touch us or us touch it, or think of the people in the Bible as being too human, even though they are very, very human. Melissa says that we are part of a large family, including Abraham and Joseph, speaks to the diversity of that family. We need to remember that today. Agreed. There are many, and, like, when we say, like, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, the people that were mentioned in this psalm specifically, we are talking about, theoretically, all people who were assigned male at birth, and people who were of one particular ethnic or racial group, and, like, they're very similar in a lot of ways. But all the people, like, think of all the people that aren't mentioned in these texts, right? Think of all the people that think of Rachel and Leah, think of Sarah, think of the midwives who rescued Moses, right? Like, think of all the people who aren't mentioned in this particular psalm but are part of the story, and the story wouldn't exist without them. So that's another thing I think that we have to think of when we think about our history or our ancestors is who are we not seeing? Who are we forgetting about? Because there are plenty of ancestors that are definitely worth our time and attention who maybe don't get as much of the limelight. Amory says, as a part of the first commandment promise, I will show loving kindness to tens of thousands who love me and keep my commandments. There is a continuity to faith which God honors through time. Absolutely. I was always really encouraged and sort of heartened by, there's that bit where God says that, or I think it's either in Exodus or Deuteronomy, where God talks about like visiting the iniquity of the parents among the children to I think it's the third and fourth generation, if I remember right. Maybe it's fourth and fifth generation. But then showing loving kindness to like the 100th generation, right? So this idea that like, yes, God can be mad. Yes, God can be upset with a person and their actions, but God's love far outstretches God's need for punishment or anything else. And that's always really encouraging to me. So let's go to our second psalm here. We're going to go to Psalm 77, and we are going to read it just in two parts. It's a much shorter psalm, so we're going to read it in two parts here. Psalm 77 is an interesting one because it doesn't just fall into one category as a psalm. It starts out as one kind of psalm, which is a personal psalm, and then it ends as a communal memory psalm or a historical psalm. So it's kind of two different kinds of psalms smashed into one. So Psalm 77, let's read the personal part first. We're going to read verses 1 through 10. I cry aloud to God that he may hear me. In the day of trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out with wearying, my soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan, I meditate and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love ceased forever? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious, and has he in anger shut up his compassion? And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. So this first part of this psalm is very sad. There's somebody who's very, very upset. The psalmist is upset and dealing with incredible sadness and some definite insomnia. I can't close my eyelids, right? I can't even speak, I'm so sad. And the psalmist is asking this question, will God forget me? Will God never again be favorable? Is his steadfast love completely gone? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has his anger shut up his compassion? All of these feelings, I think, are ones that may be familiar to you. They're definitely familiar to me. I've definitely wondered all these things once or twice. I think the really compelling first part of this psalm is where the psalmist says, I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. So like the psalmist is thinking about all these things that happened to their ancestors, right? All of the good things that God has done. And yet they're still like, okay, God, you used to do all these great things, but I am in trouble now and I feel like crap and my life sucks. Where'd you go? And so it ends with this idea, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Like this idea that God once was loving, God once was kind, God once did great things, but no longer, right? So the psalmist is sort of sighing over this. And if you've been in a similar position ever, you're not alone in that. The psalmist knows what you're going through. But then the psalmist starts thinking about all the things that God has done. And so we're going to read verses 11 through 20 here. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your works and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies thundered. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So this particular second half of the psalm is so good because it's telling the Exodus story in the same way that Psalm 105 did, right? Psalm 105 was like, and there were all these plagues, and this happened and that happened, and like Psalm 105 kind of gives you the rundown. But Psalm 77 is telling you the story of the Exodus, but it's connecting it to the psalmist's present experience, because what the psalmist is feeling right now is like the feeling of God has left me alone. And God's love has been stopped up by anger, that God's never going to be like this again. And then you get this beautiful vision of God working in creation, and the storms and the lightning and the rain and the waters, even the waters like knowing what God is capable of, right, and trembling. And then you get this moment where God, it's the visual of God parting the waters, right, and God walks through the waters. And to me, what the psalmist is doing is remembering a time when the people of Israel thought that God was gone. The people of Israel thought that God was done taking care of them. They get to the edge of the Red Sea, and they see the sea in front of them, and they see the Pharaoh's army coming behind them, and they think, oh crap, it's all over. Like, God brought us this far and has totally let us go. And in that moment, God creates a way where there was no way. God creates a path. And that's what the psalmist in this particular psalm is needing. The psalmist needs God to show a way forward when they can't see a way forward. And so the psalmist isn't just pulling up this vision of God parting the waters at the Red Sea and, in that moment of the Exodus. That's not picked out just for fun. It's because the psalmist needs a way forward. And so the psalmist remembers when God has done that for their ancestors, right? So, I wonder how we can draw on these stories and on the faith of our ancestors when we are in this position where the psalmist is saying, like, feels like God's gone, feels like God doesn't care anymore. What stories do we remember? Things of our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, our physical ancestors. What things do we remember that reminds us that God makes a way, that reminds us that when we look like we're stuck between an ocean and an army, there's going to be a way forward? Because that seems to be what gives the psalmist some hope. And you'll notice that the end of this psalm doesn't end like Psalm 105. It doesn't end with like, and now everything's fine, praise the Lord. It ends with the psalmist remembering this happening and remembering that God has done this. And that brings some kind of comfort, we assume, but it doesn't totally change. It doesn't like make everything magically all better, right? But it does give the psalmist some strength. So that's kind of, I think, where I was going with this is like, how can we remember things that were passed down to us that remind us that God makes ways out of a seemingly impossible situation? Titus says, I feel like that about this pandemic. Yeah, I know. It's that feeling of like, God, where'd you go? Everything sucks. The world's on fire. Now what? And remembering the times when God has made a way forward not only gives us strength, but I think it can make us more imaginative to see ways forward that we might not have been able to see before. That would be pretty cool. So I want to, before we finish up tonight, to go back to something that Conrad touched on earlier, which was the idea of thinking about our ancestors as still present in our lives. Spiritual ancestors, physical ancestors. One of the things that Christianity teaches is that death is not the end, right? That death does not win. And I wonder how that changes how we look at the world that we're walking through right now. If we are not alone, if we are part of what Paul calls the great cloud of witnesses. Paul, in the book of Hebrews, goes through kind of what the Psalms do here, which is like Paul literally lays out, I think it's Hebrews 11, Paul lays out all the history of Israel and then says, we are surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. All of these people who came before us are still with us. And so Conrad mentioned earlier the idea that within like Catholic tradition, for instance, the idea that the saints and the people that went before us are praying for us still now. How would it change the way you experience your life to know that the people that went before us are still with us and still praying for us and still in a relationship with God that asks for our for love and for well-being to be given to us. To have that sort of the word intercession is very, depending on if you're a Catholic or a Protestant, the word intercession might be a scary one, but like the idea of knowing that we're not alone, that we have this thing called the communion of the saints. In Christianity, the communion of the saints is something that is so ingrained in Christianity. It's in one of our oldest creeds. We talk about, we believe in the communion of the saints, that all of those who went before us are still with us, are still part of the world that we can't see right now. So would that make us feel less alone, right? Like Amory just said, we're not alone if those that went before us are still with us, because death isn't the end. We are still part of this communion of saints. So those are kind of the thoughts that I want to leave us with tonight, because our hour is up. But I wonder, we're going to be talking tomorrow, if you are part of our Transmission Ministry Collective General Support Group that meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're going to be talking about our ancestors tomorrow, when I can actually talk with you all instead of me just talking and you typing. We can all actually talk. And we're going to talk about who are our spiritual ancestors and how are they working or relevant in our lives. So that's going to be our question for tomorrow. So if you're not familiar with TMC and our support groups, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now so that you can check that out and get connected. But tomorrow at our support group, we're going to be talking about our ancestors and how they are relevant in our lives and how we are part of this great communion of saints. Aw, Conrad says, I've been drawn to a more traditional Christian tradition and Anglo-Catholic church since my grandma died. I truly think my grandma and Catholic ancestors have been praying and guiding me that way. I know it's a little silly probably, but it feels right. I don't think that's silly. I think that's seeing, I don't know. I understand why it would feel silly, but I also think that, for instance, in the Nicene Creed, we talk about how we believe that God created all things seen and unseen. We recognize that there are things outside of our perception, and sometimes we can understand God working in our lives in a way that might seem silly, but can feel very, very real and true. So thanks for sharing that, Conrad. Amory says the same. There you go. Not weird, Conrad. You're not even alone in that. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here tonight, for talking about ancestors, and for talking about Psalms 105 and 77. It's been really great. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to put them in the comments below. Check out the TMC link to check out all the things that we do. And we are going to have our next Bible study will be in 2 weeks. And until then, between now and then, we have support groups. So check those out. And we will talk to you all soon. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Bye, everybody.